Gary, welcome.
Thanks, Phil.
You've got a real illustrious background. You've been involved in so many different things. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I've been really fortunate. I've been in the business for almost 40 years, worked at McGraw-Hill on the world's first data networking magazine called Data Communications, and for the last almost 30 years at IDG as publisher of Network World, Computer World, and CIO for 17 years. And I've met lots of people, and right now I'm still actively engaged, and I write a column on for the Wall Street Journal, CIO Journal, on tech talent. So it's pretty busy.
Also, your latest book, U.S. Technology Skills Gap, it's very interesting. Why did you write it? What was the impetus for this?
I often get asked that question, why'd you write it? It was because CIOs were starting to share with me their thoughts back 7 years ago that they're finding it difficult to hire men and women with the skills they needed. So I was at a conference in Cincinnati, and a speaker starts the conference. He goes, the first thing I want to do is, I'm going to read this, you tell me when it was written and who wrote it. And I'm paraphrasing here. He reads, our nation is at risk, we're swimming in a sea of mediocrity. If another country did what we're doing to our education system, we would consider it an act of war. Wow. So then people would raise their hand and say, oh, that was Tom Friedman in the foreword to The World is Flat. And it wasn't. It was in the preface to a report called A Nation at Risk that was written in the Reagan administration in 1983. So you're a journalist, and I wrote a column. When I would write a column in the magazine, I'd get 5 responses. That'd be a good column. So I wrote a column about a nation at risk, and I got 50 responses. Then I cobbled together those comments and wrote another column about it and got 500. So I said, this is interesting. And then I spent 6 years researching the skills and skills gap in science and math education in our country.
In our digital age, if you were going to write a tweet about the central theme of the book, what would it say?
The central theme of the book is, I'm borrowing from Confucius here. And think about this as a country. If a country wants 1 year of prosperity, grow grain. If you want 10 years of prosperity, grow a tree. If you want 100 years of prosperity, grow people. So the book is all about the importance of growing people, particularly in this such a busy, globally connected business environment we're all working in right now.
You write a lot about the skills gap, and there's lots that people are saying about it. The New York Times called it mostly corporate fiction, so that's one end of the extreme. On the other extreme, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Business Roundtable claim it's real. So what's your take based on all the research you've done?
It's very real. But the food fight that we're having is people like it's a group, the editorial board of the New York Times, will look at it and say the skills gap is caused mostly by companies who are either too selective in who they hire, too stingy with what they're willing to pay, and oh, by the way, they're not going to offer any corporate training and development. They want to hire someone who's been to the moon and back, plug them right in, square peg in a square hole, and off we go. However, if you look at the data, like the Business Roundtable research that you referenced, 96% of the top 250 CEOs in the country say the skills gap is very real. If you look at closer to home in the information technology industry, Society for Information Management, SIM, does its report each year on what are the key trends. And besides security, right, which is number one,
right,
the most worrisome issue for IT executives and CIOs this year is the skills gap. So it's very real, and it's growing. In fact, I've created an index. Remember the misery index back in the Carter administration back in the 70s? Right. I've created the U.S. misery index for the skills gap,
right,
and so benchmarked it to 2004. And right now, it's 20% wider than it was 10 years ago.
To get a little more specific about what the skill gaps are, what do you see as the areas where these skills need to be improved?
That is a good question. In terms of, is it math, is it science, is it both? In the 20th century, reading proficiency was table stakes to get a job. Right. In the 21st century, it is just proficiency in math and science. You've got to do that. There's a whole new set of employability skills, right, that are lacking, that are hard to teach whether it's in public education or in higher ed. Things like, how do you teach someone to process massive amounts of data and make sense of it? How do you teach someone to work in cross-cultural environments? How do you teach someone to think collaboratively and creatively? The Institute for the Future has done, in my opinion, to researching the book, the best job, isolating 10 of these different areas. These are the skills that are the hardest to find. I mean, if you want to find someone who's doing well in math, that's not too hard. But employers are having a more difficult time is in these other areas, which some people call soft skills. And every time I hear soft skills, it's like fingernails on a blackboard. These are not soft skills. They're hard skills, and it's not easy to master them.
So as we enter the digital age, every company, whether they realize it or not, is a technology company.
Absolutely.
So from a CIO perspective, and you've met with a lot of CIOs, what should they be working on? Do they really understand the skills gap?
Some of them do, some of them don't. Most important skill that a CIO to succeed needs to practice every single day is visiting customers. And by customers, I mean not just external customers. That's self-evident, but partners, and most importantly, employees. And how much time should they be spending? You talk to Jim Cash up at Harvard. He says if you're not spending 30% of your time visiting customers, you're not doing your job. And it's an incredibly difficult job. And last year in the wintertime, CIO Magazine names its conference rooms after candies. And so the conference room next to my office was the M&M's room. So on one of those late winter afternoons, I was hungry, I needed a chocolate fix, so I go across, and the canister that has the candy is empty. But I knew where the facilities person put the candy, so when I went to that drawer, not only did I find the M&Ms, I found something a lot sweeter. I found the original issue of CIO Magazine. So I brought it into my office, and I started to read it. And what was shocking, Phil, is that what we were talking about back in 1987, the importance of CIOs and IT execs to be business-savvy executives, was front and center then, and it's front and center now. And the latest State of the CIO survey that just came out suggests that even CIOs, a third of the CIOs, and over 50% of other C-level execs, see IT as an obstacle rather than an enabler in their businesses. And that's got to change. And the way that changes is by CIOs visiting customers and listening to their pain.
I know you've talked about what Gardner calls the five-headed digital dragon. So it's cloud, mobility, social, security, and business analytics now, which is really it's the buzzword. How would you suggest CIOs stay relevant on the technology side so they focus in the areas that are really important?
Well, it gets back to the customer angle. But what's interesting in the context of that five-headed digital dragon that Gartner created the alliteration of, or portrayal of, is that this is the first time in the modern era of IT, Phil, that IT execs and CIOs are having to deal with 5 tsunamis at once. Because back in 1950, it was the mainframe. John Gantz, my colleague at IDC, has created this theory that every 15 years since 1950, a new force has come in. So it was the mainframe in 1950. 1965 was the mini computer. 1980, it was the PC client server era. 1995, it was e-commerce. And in 2010, we started to see all the 5 areas that you just mentioned. And it's incredibly complex. And what's even more complex, and that's why CIOs need to understand deeply what their customers, what their needs are, is that in this era, whether it's analytics, CMOs are going out and buying software packages and plugging them in. HR is doing the same thing. Whether it's mobile, bring your own device, security, cloud, customers are enabled and empowered. And it's so difficult to successfully navigate through the digital waters of those 5 waves, so to speak.
So what would be your suggestion in terms of what should CIOs focus on to help build the skills gap that you talk about?
Well, first of all, they have to understand that as we move forward, some of the skills, I've just written about this, Eric Bajofsson up at MIT has written a number of books
Yes.
on machines and robots and sensors and how they're going to be coming in force. This is the first time in history that humans have had a more difficult time keeping up with the pace of machine adoption. So Peter Sondergaard, taking Eric's point up at Gartner, he claims within 5 years, 75% of IT execs who are working in IT infrastructure jobs right now, their jobs will no longer exist. Gone. If 33% of knowledge workers, their jobs will no longer exist within 5 years. So what a CIO needs to do, just setting that as context, is look out, I wouldn't say 5 years, look out 2 to 3 years and try to identify what are the skills that they're going to need. Again, I'm using Gartner as a reference point here, but they're very respected. They claim the need for digital skills in those 5 bucket areas we talked about, analytics, security, mobile, they're going to increase 500% in the next 5 years. CIOs need to proactively, I don't think they're very good at this at all, proactively visit universities and colleges and recruit who they consider to be some of the best and brightest.
Right.
They've got to do more of that. Because if they don't have the skills, they don't have a staff to implement these new technologies that are coming down the pike, they're not going to be successful at their job, and someone else will come in and do it. And there's no chief electricity officers, and that's the other whole thing. What is the role of the CIO going forward? I mean, what it's in the beginning. I get back to that customer angle.
Right.
It's not managing infrastructure. Mm-hmm. You want to do that? You want to manage that and legacy applications? No, machines are going to do all that. So you better be out there understanding customers. If you're going to write software, you better do it in an agile kind of way, as an example. Mm-hmm. That whole business iteration. Because if you don't, it will mean CIO and his career is over.
What do you see in terms of the relevance of third-party training organizations to help assess an IT organization in terms of the skills, and then improving those skills and basically developing a whole learning program? I
think it's critical. If you think back to earlier in the conversation, when I was talking about the skills gap and what some say are causing it, stingy employers in terms of too selective. You'll see job descriptions that are 800 words or more. They're not willing to pay. But I think the third issue is much more important than the prior two, and that is they're not offering comprehensive training and development.
Right.
And they've got to. And if they don't have the time, because staffs are lean, and they're out there visiting customers, as I was suggesting that they do, you're leveraging and partnering with third parties to identify. The key thing that the CIO has to do is identify out 24, 36 months what he or she thinks the skills are going to be. They're going to need Ruby on Rails, they're going to need this, they're going to need that, and then go in and partner with groups to teach train their employees. Because it's not just attracting talent, it's retaining talent. And if you can't retain talent, you're just a zero-sum game. And so I think it's very, very important that and of those 3 areas, I think the most important, Accenture recently did a study that said in the last 5 years, 80% of companies offered no corporate training and development. None. Zero.
Right.
That's unconscionable. And it's got to change, and that's, I think, the sweet spot of narrowing, in my opinion, the skills gap. I mean, because there's a lot of other things that can go into it, but front and center, if they can leverage partnerships with firms to teach the relevant skills. So what might be relevant in your company might be different, the relevancy in my company, but the identification of what the skills are and then getting someone to come in and help train is critical.
What advice would you give to training companies in terms of approaching corporations, CIOs, in terms of what's the message that would really help the CIO light bulb go on and say, hey, I really need you?
Selling's all about one thing, identifying pain.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the SIM study that we talked about in this conversation, that if IT skills gap is the second most worrisome issue, I mean, a training company doesn't have to, it's not like shooting, it's like fish in a barrel. You get a CIO, and you sit down and talk to these people, and you weave in quickly, what are they doing on talent development, talent retention? Is it a problem? Is it a concern? You're going to get yes more often than not. But it gets back to what the advice I was sharing earlier in terms of CIOs knowing customers. It's the same thing as for training development companies, to know CIOs. And one of the things I say to people who are out selling to CIOs, particularly selling to publicly traded companies, go in and pull down a company's SEC 10K. You and I are both runners, so we know a 10K is a 6-mile race.
Right.
But it's also a document that is just a treasure trove of pain. Yeah. In that 10K, companies by law, public companies by law, must list risks to the business. And over the last couple of months, I've gone in and looked at mostly technology companies, almost every single one of them. Somewhere in those lists of risks is talent. Can we retain, can we develop, can we attract talent? And so I would tell them to share with them to go in and look at an SEC 10K before they go calling a CIO for a publicly traded company.
You obviously have done a lot over your career and the 6 years of writing the book. So what's the key learning that has most impressed you?
When I was growing up, learning and knowing, I'm kind of trying to use these synonymously, kind of was parsed as what you knew. And if you were smarter than the next person, you might get along a little faster in your career. Now, that's no longer the case. Learning, in my mind, we're in a just-in-time learning environment. Yeah. So if you ask me a question, I don't know it, I can just sit down at Bing or Google or whatever my favorite search engine is and type in the question, I'm going to get the answer. Yeah. So it's not what you know. The key aspect of learning, in my opinion, is what can you do with what you know? What can you create with what you know? That is going to be the real advantage going forward.